Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the fourth and final lecture in our 2026 lecture series. My name is Joseph Cronin. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute, London. This lecture series is held in collaboration with the German Historical Institute London. And I'm delighted that this evening we are joined by Dr. Felix Lüdger from the Institute, who is going to say a few words.
Yes, thank you, Joe, and good evening, everyone. Um, I want to basically just welcome you all on behalf of the German Historical Institute. We're very proud that we cooperate in this lecture series, and we're very grateful that we're still cooperating because usually these lectures, or a few of these lectures every year, would be hosted in our institute on Bloomsbury Square, which is, as some of you may know, currently undergoing renovation, so we can't host any events at the moment, or the staff have moved out, or the events have moved out. And this is a project that's been about to happen for many years now, until it's now actually happening. So we've been not hosting this lecture for, I think, 2 years now, at least. But just today, we've been given a date that we can move back in the spring next year. So I'm very confident that we will be able to welcome you all in Bloomsbury Square for the next or lecture after that in the next year, in a new and apparently very amazing conference room that we will have. Thank you all for coming again, and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lüdger. That is certainly fantastic news. So it is a pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Julia Ung, reader in critical theory at Goldsmiths, University of London, and co-director of the Centre for Philosophy and Critical Thought. Dr. Ung is a leading scholar of 20th century critical theory with particular expertise in the intersections of philosophy, literature, political thought, and modern mathematics. Much of her work engages with the writings of Walter Benjamin and Gershom Scholem, as well as broader traditions in modern Jewish political thought. She is the co-editor of the critical edition of Benjamin's Toward the Critique of Violence and of important volumes on Friedrich Hölderlin and the Marburg School. Her research has been supported by major awards, including a British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship. And next year, she will serve as a senior fellow of the University Alliance Ruhr. Before joining Goldsmiths, Dr. Ung held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard University. Her current work explores the relationship between Daoism, capitalism, and early critical theory, extending her long-standing interest in the philosophical, philological, and political dimensions of modern thought. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Julia.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you also, Joseph, for your kind invitation to speak to you today. As part of the Leo Baeck Institute's lecture series this year, I'm delighted and honored to be able to share with you my current work on the relationship of Daoism to early critical theory, not least because of the important role that the Leo Baeck Institute archives played in the initial stages of my research, because it was in fact thanks to a visiting fellowship at the Center for Jewish History in New York in 2022 that I was first able to devote some time to articulating the outlines of my project, as a direct result of which was how I got the funding from the British Academy to complete my research and draft my manuscript. Now that I'm nearing its completion, it's especially meaningful for me to have been invited back to the Leo Baeck Institute, as it were, to reflect on the beginnings of my project, and this in view of a particularly difficult and central complex of issues. For I ask, why did a critical mass of major figures in and adjacent to German Jewish thought at the beginning of the 20th century converge upon Daoism as a source of critical social theory? And what is the significance of the fact that they did so? For it was the case that figures here, from Benjamin, Buber, Rosenzweig, and Kafka to Bloch, Brecht, Adorno, and even Horkheimer drew on Taoist ideas in their major writings, sometimes in almost inconspicuous ways, but coalescing when taken together into an alternative testament to the early years of what would become later known as the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Their sources, meanwhile, which included philosophical texts, legends, and literary works in translation, and analyses of contemporary politics and society, were the products of a network of intermediaries ranging from translators and philosopher enthusiasts to former missionaries turned sinologists and lectors employed by language schools to train would-be officers and tradespeople in the service of the Wilhelmine Empire's short-lived but significant colonial political economic aspirations in the northeast China of the late 19th century. Yet, though this largely textual corpus is what registers as China in their writings, and despite the obviously Orientalist framework within which these images of China tended to circulate, Orientalism does not suffice as a theoretical framework to adequately capture what transforms in their hands into speculations on alternatives to the capitalist ethic. In fact, as we shall see, Orientalist sources were used for anti-Orientalist arguments that resisted the exploitation of an other imagined to be available for extraction because primitive, outside of history, and in that sense abstract and unreal. Nevertheless, Orientalism has continued to inform the scholarship. For instance, in respect to Kafka, whose deployment of Chinese themes is reduced to a foil for exploring his sense of alienation as a German-speaking Jew in Prague, and more broadly in a Europe escalating towards fascism when it comes to studies of Kafka's readers, such as Benjamin and Adorno. Or alternatively, the charge of Orientalism doubles as an excuse to ignore references to anything Chinese, let alone anything specifically Taoist, as secondary or irrelevant to doctrinal issues, such as in the case of Rosenzweig scholarship, which struggles to distinguish between China, India, and what Rosenzweig calls pagan, by which he actually meant Greek antiquity. And finally, in the case of scholarship in the Frankfurt School, which to my knowledge has yet to acknowledge the presence of any thinking with respect to China in the work of its major founding figures. I contest the utility of this framework. Not only do I believe that the textual evidence speaks against it, I also think that it does not begin to address the ramifications of the fact that German Jews were utilizing and transforming a part of the Christian colonial archive into a radically profane theory of economic life, had homed in on a very specific part of that archive to do so, namely Taoism, a choice whose counterintuitive nature I will explain shortly, and moreover, did so in reflection of their own precarious and highly contradictory position in respect to the history of political economy. Sketching this out is the aim of my talk today, for which purpose I will focus on one specific interchange. Let me thus begin with a quote. "The godheads of China and India are immense edifices built from the blocks of ancestral times, as monoliths in the cults of the primitives. They still rise up into our time." This statement, which appears in the first part of the Star of Redemption, illustrates for that work's author, Franz Rosenzweig, a peculiar trajectory. On the one hand, China, along with India, serves as a negative example that Rosenzweig gives to illustrate the possibility of systematically progressing towards redemptive knowledge of the all. In terms of the star's overall arc, at every stage of the advance towards grasping God, world, and human as products of the unity of affirmation and negation, China represents one factual instance of the failure to grasp these elements as such, that is, systematically, as the identity of identity and difference. Taoism, in particular, plays a specific role in Rosenzweig's explication, which spans all three books of the first part of the Star. First, Rosenzweig writes, China's conception of heaven is raised to be world-embracing in such a way that it arranged the entire universe into an enormous ball of its ruling arbitrariness, leaving nothing outside of its power. Its activity, then, is therefore the result of a simple and ever-renewed negation of the nothing, as epitomized for Rosenzweig by the Tao, which is, quote, only this being effective without action, and as a result, equivalent to an empty room of non-thought. Being non-generative of external form, the negation of the nothing represented by the Tao thus remains inferior to those Olympian gods, who, despite remaining enclosed in their world, live because they have a concept of configuring themselves from a balance between arbitrariness and necessity. Second, China represents a prefigural development of elementary being that, in regarding the plenitude of the world as the only real thing, turns all that is spiritual into spirits, that is, of ancestors, and overcrowds the world with their abundant particularities. The only means to overcome this concrete plenitude of becoming is discovered by Lao Tzu, who solves the mystery of ruling by proposing to configure the world without doing and without not doing, a solution that, in returning to the nameless original ground of occurrence, cannot compete with the Greeks in guiding the species along the road to clarity. Finally, China is cast as therefore having never articulated the will and essence necessary for the emergence of a defiant self, as epitomized by the hero of Attic tragedy. Because in China, the human being is marked by feeling that has been purified of any relation to character, that is, to a bearer endowed with a propensity to withstand encounters with moving situations without being suffocated by them. The incapacity to be tragic epitomized by the Taoist sage, China is thus the home of an Eastern religion of the spirit bypassed by the path leading from the Greek mythical conception of God to the living God of the monotheistic religions, the famous path leading the history of philosophy from Ionia to Jena, or that is Hegel. Yet its godheads still rise up into our time. And, as Rosenzweig notes in the third book, India and China have shown the only two ways in which man can, at all times, turn away before his self when he cannot muster the courage to become tragic. Precisely in not grasping the identity of identity and difference, China reaches us in our contemporaneity, counting among the multiplicity of the nothing that philosophy presupposes to this day, but suppressed for 2.5 millennia. Just over a decade later, Walter Benjamin takes up Rosenzweig's proposal. In an essay from 1934, ostensibly devoted to the work of Franz Kafka, Benjamin repeatedly draws comparisons to the characterless Chinese sage and non-symbolic gestures typical of Chinese theater, China's ancestor cult, and the Taoist principle of non-action, citing the Star of Redemption as his only source on China. In describing Karl Rossmann, a figure in the novel America who performed several too high, time-consuming, and useless leaps on the racetrack, Benjamin refers to Rosenzweig's depiction of the Chinese person's interior as devoid of character. Epitomized by the sage who, quote, blurs any possible individuality, Rosenzweig writes in the passage that is cited by Benjamin, what, quote, distinguishes a Chinese person is something quite different from character, a wholly elementary purity of feeling. Such purity of feeling, as described by Rosenzweig, underpins what Benjamin identifies as Chinese theater's code of gestures, which have no symbolism intended by the author at the outset, but instead have their meaning derived in, quote, their ever-changing contexts and experimental groupings. The Chinese elementary purity of feeling is also, according to Benjamin's second citation of Rosenzweig, that which underpins what Benjamin calls Kafka's strongest gesture, namely shame, which, far from being just an intimate reaction, is, quote, a consequential one for societies that is borne out by its propensity for moving masses of historical happenings at the scale of Weltalter and affecting a family of the indeterminate membership and dimensions, or what Benjamin dubs Kafka's swamp world, Sumpfeld. Benjamin then likens the resultant seasickness on solid ground and fluctuating nature of experiences to two things. First, the sacred Jewish ritual of erasing sins from the Book of Memory, and second, Rosenzweig's depiction of the Chinese cult of ancestors, which reinforces for Benjamin the idea that forgetting itself is never individual, but mingles with what has been forgotten of the pre-world to form countless, uncertain, changing compounds that yield constantly new, strange products. Such mingling with ancestors in the fullness of world, as Rosenzweig puts it, brings forth the animals and creatures such as Otodek in Kafka's depictions of community, and it also therefore distorts time, as imagined as a linear progression of moments, which Benjamin finds epitomized in Rosenzweig's description of the Tao as the, quote, nothing that makes something useful, and makes studying, i.e., a non-action directed exclusively at not forgetting in Kafka, into a possibility of redemption. Now, Benjamin's Kafka essay is, of course, ultimately about showing how, as he puts it, in every case of Kafka's work, it is a question of how life and work are organized in human society. Specifically, the world that Kafka diagnoses is a society in which organization has been substituted for destiny, in which law books and court documents determine relations yet remain obscure to the people, in which holders of bureaucratic power ceaselessly make insignificant movements that nevertheless set cosmic ages in motion, and whose violent ambiguities manifest only in unwritten norms, whose transgression seems fated, yet in the face of which any action aiming at a consequence is revealed as mere diversion. One would, of course, be entirely within one's rights to ask whether characterizing modern life and labor as a swamp world, whose fate-like elements rise up into the present, Benjamin uses the same verb as Rosenzweig does, hineinragen, right, in and as a function of their very forgottenness, risks, in fact, remaining mired in the archaic. One would also be in very good company, for this was precisely Theodor Adorno's objection, which in his lengthy commentary on the essay, he elaborates as Benjamin's failure to, quote, thoroughly dialecticize the relation between prehistory and modernity in Kafka's imagery. Yet, such an approach that insists on grasping myth as a symptom of our modern condition, and in turn Kafka's China as a mere element of that myth, fails to consider the propensity for what Benjamin calls heteric elements to distort the very category of the modern through which the mythic is supposed to have been mediated and appears as mythic. Indeed, in his response to Adorno, Benjamin refuses Adorno's salvational gesture of interpreting Kafka's imagery as signs of a reified and damaged life that nevertheless transcends and survives the conditions of reification, which would leave the boundaries of the naturalization of those conditions intact until the end of history. Instead, the question that Benjamin raises is this: might the key to understanding and distorting the modern organization of life and work, together with all its purposeless gestures that nevertheless lead to consequences of seemingly cosmic necessity and proportion, might the key to understanding this be found in the description of such a world that has been demystified of a salvational horizon, and is indeed therefore radically oriented towards nothing, a world that is such as Lao Tzu's. In other words, the real question for me that Benjamin asks us to pose is why he uses Rosenzweig's pronouncements of Daoism on Daoism's deviation from the path of philosophical world history in order to explicate what he regards as an account of a radically profane theory of work and life, manifest in what he sees as the Chinese figures in Kafka's work. Before I go any further, though, let me provide you some context that explains just how unusual and deserving of closer attention this is. For there's a long tradition of thinking that was alternately Sinophilic and Sinophobic that has portrayed Chinese thought and Confucianism in particular, as a secular state practice that, because of its perceived lack of a religious characteristic of its own, therefore does not stand in the way of the educated elites being losslessly converted to Christianity. Purveyors of the accommodationist view, as it was known, were the Jesuits, such as Matteo Ricci, this person depicted in Confucianist costume, right? Who argued that the Chinese worship of ancestors and of Confucius was secular and civic, and that therefore there was no need for the Chinese to abandon their millennia-old practices as a precondition to joining the faith. Others, namely the Dominicans and the Franciscans, disagreed, holding such practices to be idolatrous and superstition-laden, and Chinese thought to lack anything that might resemble Genesis, a divine lawgiver, or the Passion of Christ. These controversies over rites and terms had political implications, as the Jesuit-aligned Portuguese and the Dominican and Franciscan-aligned Spanish facilitated two jurisdictions in China that were competing with one another, with the understanding that whichever missionary camp won the theological debate would also establish the merchant routes and colonies that would fill the imperial coffers back in Europe. Daoism, in this picture, has a sectarian character and does not figure at all except to be excoriated, typically together with Buddhism, as a popular practice with no bearing on the literati who populated the echelons of government. Despite the fact that by the time Matteo Ricci arrived in China, there was already a syncretist movement well underway that sought to unite the three schools into one, partly as a way for the Ming emperors to expand their political and social control, the same sharp demarcation and dismissal of Daoism as exclusively comprised of its popular form was replicated upon its entry into European philosophy. Leibniz, author of this, who first seriously engaged with Chinese philosophy and religion after meeting the Jesuit missionary Claudio Grimaldi in 1689, defended the accommodationist view, so Matteo Ricci's, which was largely compatible with his own cosmopolitanism, yet had very little to say about Daoism. In fact, in his eagerness to prove the compatibility of Chinese and Christian concepts of spirit and matter, soul and God, Leibniz attributes to Confucius key terms that in fact derived from philosophical Daoism. In the Discourse on the Natural Theology of the Chinese of 1716, Leibniz identifies Li, the Confucian principle of order, with the great void, which as sovereign plenitude fills all and leaves nothing empty, just as we explain the immensity of God as being everywhere and as the order of things insofar as they are considered coexisting from their relation to a common principle, without realizing that Tai Su was originally a Taoist term that came into Confucian parlance to denote Qi as something formless yet existent, and therefore as a rebuttal of the Buddhist view of non-existence. In another chapter, another paragraph, he also reproduces the European view of Taoists as sorcerers, without comment. Moreover, Leibniz claims that the Tai Zi, or yin-yang symbol, denotes the working of the Li on the Qi, or primordial matter, as the principle and end of all things, that imparts to them their effective and true being without an atom of imperfection, and thus in harmony with the Christian account of Genesis, even though not Li but Dao is the actual term that comes up in the text on which this claim is based. Now, notably, Leibniz's systematic, if sometimes unwitting, suppression of philosophical Taoism is compatible also with his view on race. In the New Essays on Human Understanding, which was written around 1705, Leibniz speculates on an inundation of imaginary Australians on European shores, who, if proven to be incapable of conversion to Christianity, would need to be distinguished by some artificial external mark. Though, he quickly adds, this is merely a thought experiment, since we humans are the only rational animals on the globe. Thus, only if Australians convert are they admissible to the race called human beings, and only if they are convertible in principle and racial difference thus non-existent in fact, can each human being be, by the principle of grace, considered the lowest species, which is to say irreducible to any other component species, like such as race. As the scholarship has noted, when writing about Australians, Leibniz may well have been thinking about the Frankfurt Jews, who were forced to wear marks on their clothing and whose capacity for redemption was by no means self-evident to everyone. This speculative alignment of Taoists with Jews, for Taoists too are admissible to the cosmopolis only if they in principle share with Christendom their conceptions of the beginning and end of all things, persisted, reappearing in spite of any other differences in their theorization of race in Immanuel Kant's thinking on teleology. Kant, who replaces Leibniz's conviction that human reason can acquire knowledge of supersensible entities, including the soul, God, and final purposes, with his discovery of the transcendental principle of autonomy, carves out a tenuous path for the human species to travel. Cleaving to the natural purposiveness of all embodied beings, yet endowed with purposes of its own. Kant therefore disputes that all human beings are members of the city of God by the principle of grace, arguing instead that the world of grace was at most a necessary idea of reason from a practical standpoint, since every human being must have the rational freedom to defy their natural purposiveness. Kant's theory of race finds its generative ground here. Everyone who is a member of the race of rational beings called human is in principle capable of fulfilling this demand of pure practical reason, of course, but given the self-limiting character that Kant saw in nature's vital principle, there are in fact fixed transformations that express potentialities, and these fixed transformations are what Kant identifies with racial difference. The implication is that only one race, in fact, has the purpose-setting capacity that sets the purpose for nature as a whole. From his writings on universal natural history from 1755 to his essays on the different human races of 1775 and anthropology of 1798, Kant develops an account of physical and moral relations based on a progressive capacity to freely use one's understanding and assume accountability the further one stands from matter and lifts oneself from the, quote, passive condition of being ruled by sensory enticements. In the 1788, on the use of teleological principles in philosophy, Kant makes explicit the link that he sees between the absence of an inner drive toward activity and certain races, given their supposed incapacity to persevere, even when removed from their native climes, i.e., their material conditions. Kant responding there to an account that he cites of freed Black slaves in Europe and America, who reportedly engaged in nothing one might call work. Finally, Kant extends his analysis to the work of reason itself, postulating that only such inquiry that adheres to the limits imposed by reason on the positing of fundamental forces to explain the derivation of all species from a single source, despite its being a hereditary defect to wish to do so, constitutes making an effort in the realm of a true metaphysics that does not wander off into a wasteland. This effort, this Mühe, in turn, is underwritten by an ability or willingness to make one's occupation on earth a fruitful one, which Kant links to differentially inherited qualities when he distinguishes between us and Taoists, among other peoples, in his 1794 essay, The End of All Things. For in that essay, The End of All Things, Kant associates the dogmatic view that the final purpose of existence, of the existence of rational beings on earth can be theoretically known, the view that he also associates with Leibniz's metaphysics, with a variety of characters from, quote, the greatest part of the human race, dervishes, Persians, Brahmanists, Tibetans, and, quote, other sages of the Orient, and indeed also, quote, self-styled sages in all ages, all of whom erroneously, from Kant's perspective, expect that only if rational beings conform to the final purpose of their existence does creation have a value. And moreover, that human nature is so corrupt that this end must be pictured as terrible and utterly hopeless. Taoists play a special role in Kant's explication of this error. To represent the end of things as a cognizable object is to imagine a time in which all alteration ceases, which necessarily appears as annihilation because thinking, which involves reflecting and thus occurs in time, is called upon to think the cessation of time and therefore the cessation of thinking itself. Brooding on this has begotten what he calls the monstrous system of Lao Kun. That's a name for Lao Tzu. Kant writes, which does not satisfy itself with the practical use of the final end as an idea in pursuit of which individual agency cultivates the moral disposition, but instead dwells in the supposed satisfaction of having reached or reaching a state of eternal tranquility, even though this state is where understanding exhausts itself and thinking ceases. Moreover, this is not true only of Taoists, but of all those who share their agency annihilating premise. So again, Tibetans, quote, other Oriental peoples, but also in this passage, pantheists, enthusiasts, and specifically Spinozists, whose system was begotten from the philosophical sublimation of Oriental pantheism and was closely akin to the very ancient system of emanation of human souls from the Godhead and their final reabsorption into it. It is no accident that Kant refers to self-styled sages from all ages, for there was one figure in his age who was widely referred to as a sage, and moreover was mired in defending an idea of rational religion against the charge of pantheism, namely Moses Mendelssohn. Without getting into the details of the Pantheismus-Streit or its relation to this essay, let me lay out some of the ramifications of Kant's comparison of the Jewish sage to the Taoist. First, it bears mentioning that Mendelssohn himself made only scant references to anything Chinese. In one letter to Lessing, he refers to Voltaire's play Un Orphelin de Chine, and in another letter to a Chinese Schauspiel, but makes no references in the Morgenstunden, for instance, the work in which he defends Lessing. Mendelssohn does, however, include Chinese religions in his call for toleration, arguing, for instance, in his preface to the translation of Manasseh ben Israel's Vindicare Judaeorum, in favor of human rights for all, the all including heathens, Jews, Muslims, and followers of the natural religions, that is, those who deny the revelation. Kant, for his part, pictures the representative of the Haskalah and defender of the idea that religious differences are a matter of history alone and not of reason, as practically seeing himself reflected as the Taoist state, in the Taoist sage, quote, sitting in a dark room with his eyes closed, exerting himself to think and sense his own nothingness in order to arrive at a presentiment of the annihilation of his personality. Second, Kant regards this species of teleological thinking as an unproductive use of reason that moreover amounts to not really making an effort or doing genuine work, the work of reason, right? A non-productivity that he sees variously displayed in different peoples. In the same preface to Manasseh, Mendelssohn notes the change in the quality of anti-Semitism in the Age of Enlightenment. Accusations of blood libel or well poisoning have been replaced with charges of a lack of moral refinement, an inclination to deception and usury, and an incapacity for conducting useful trade, which are used to shut them out of economic activity that they are then criticized for not performing. Third, Kant may have received his information on Taoism in part from Pierre Sonnerat, Louis XIV's envoy to China, who published a report in 1783 called Reise nach Ostindien und China in den Jahren 1774 bis 1881, which was aimed at legitimizing the expansion of trade and colonization by accusing the Jesuits of having cast an unduly positive light on Chinese civic ritual, governance, and attitude towards trade in an attempt to prop up their own despotic power. By contrast, Sonnerat claims the Chinese are, in his words, weak, slavish, superstitious, and altogether unjust in their business dealings with the West, their all-around impotence, Ohnmacht, leading them to not do what it might take to settle foreign disputes in their own terms, to know their own laws such that they do not submit at the first hint of violence, and to dispel the mystery with which their philosophy surrounds and limits their conception of power. In other words, by the age of Kant, the Jesuits had lost the debate, not just to the Franciscans and Dominicans, but also to the mercantilists, who were non-scholars, unlike the Jesuits, who now pictured China as a land of endless study and intellectualized non-activity, and of sectarian practices standing in the way of economic utility and productive enterprise, ruleless machinic industry that was incompatible with the dynamics of the global political economy. This picture imagines China as though Daoism, understood as a profane religion of superstition and politically ineffectual magic, underpinned all the land's belief systems and economic practices, even if covertly, though still at the cost of suppressing its significance as more than just a degenerate form of philosophical Daoism. In view of the widespread transmission of this picture that followed, Kant's emphasis on the embodied practice of Taoist, viz. Jewish teleological thinking, fits a broader pattern of capital-driven thought. Kant's intertwining of preconceptions of Taoist and Jewish inactivity also fits a persistent pattern by which activity was racialized. The Aryan myth inaugurated by Friedrich Schlegel's On the Language and Wisdom of the Indians from 1808 anchored German salvationist nationalism in the claim that languages descended from Sanskrit shared the principle that their relationships and subtleties of meaning were signified not by appended particles or helping verbs, but rather by verbal inflection, that is, by modification to the root rather than a separate verb, a separate word, which he conceived as the living seed of sentences. This is diametrically opposed to the grammar of other languages, including Chinese and Hebrew, which made use of affixa, according to Schlegel, rather than inflection, and were therefore lesser, mechanical, not organic, and passive in respect to contributing to the moral development of humanity. The racialization of non-activity along the Aryan active and Chinese Semitic passive binary persisted well after secular linguistic genealogies replaced biblical accounts of the emergence of cultural difference. Most relevantly for my discussion today, it eventually found expression in a debate at the turn of the 20th century that set the terms for how to comprehend the emergence of difference in modern economic life. Werner Sombart, the historian and sociologist who wrote a book entitled Die Juden das Wirtschaftsleben in 1911, racialized Jewish tenets concerning goods, the dangers of wealth, the quantification of sin, and business ethics concerning non-Jews in order to comprehend religion as providing a profane basis for the rationalist spirit of capitalism. In response, a colleague of Zombart's by the name of Max Weber deracialized the account of the emergence of modern rational enterprise, but replaces race with a theory of types in order to comprehend the emergence of the rational organization of capital and labor in the Occident, and to conclude that Confucianism and Taoism alike share an irrational inefficacy that, contrary to Puritan asceticism, will never give rise to an indigenous form of modern capitalism. But now let me return to Rosenzweig and Benjamin. We can recall that for Rosenzweig, China participates in the Star of Redemption's overarching project, namely to contest the assertion of a totality of the world against the multiplicity of knowledge that has persisted from Ionia to Jena. Integral to the articulation of the nothing of our knowledge that is threefold rather than singular, moreover, China also bears what Rosenzweig calls a promise of definability. We also recall that for Benjamin, reading Rosenzweig through Kafka, China is the historical philosophical index of the shame that is no longer simply a matter of individual moral sentiment, but has organized life and work in such a way that organization itself resembles fate. Incalculable, incomprehensible in its overall design, and reliant on strategic and potentially risky alliances between any number of mutually alien groupings. such as swamp world, appears at first glance to comprise the same arbitrariness, non-thought, incapacity for autonomy and organic self-formation, and purposeless gestures as populated the imaginations of German arbiters of Chinese thought from Leibniz to Weber. Replicating the picture in which a degenerate and popular version of Daoism is strictly demarcated from the domain of official power, yet inevitably pollutes the capacities of the entire race. But both Rosenzweig and Benjamin insist on the refusal of what was bypassed by the path from Ionia to Jena to be erased, and moreover in such a way that it is possible to articulate how a dyad formed of non-family resemblance and unlikely affinity, the Taoist and the Jew, came to serve as the racialized counterpart that accompanied and were even necessary to arguments for religious liberalization, transcendental autonomy, and economic modernization. A certain thinking on popular Taoism even became a vehicle for anti-Semitism, inasmuch as the intertwining of embodied Taoist and Jewish inactivity seems to have resolved any ambivalence that Kant may have had concerning whether effort meets or exceeds the certainty of fulfilling the ends of one's natural purposiveness. Rosenzweig's and Benjamin's choices to converge on Taoism as a theory of activity and organization are thus not only counterintuitive, but transformative, deliberately selecting an inconspicuous, suppressed element of the Christian colonial archive, out of which Rosenzweig intuits and Benjamin develops a description of how the human being can at all times turn away from his self, meaning the entire arbitration between arbitrariness and necessity, out of which purpose-setting purposiveness is supposed to emerge, in order to bypass the tragic. And then also use this, in turn, to present the human being's vocation on Earth as relieved of the syndromes that attend considerations of blood and territorial integrity. I will illustrate this with two examples with which I will also conclude. For Rosenzweig's source for his idea that a wholly elementary purity of feeling marks the Chinese character was not, as one might expect, like, say, Hegel's xenophobic idea of an Oriental metaphysics, but a translation of the Tang Dynasty poet Li Bai by Alfred Henschke, the German poet also known as Klabund. Here you go, this thing. Rosenzweig explains that Chinese feelings' lack of relation to any bearer, pure objectivity, and the existence in the instant of being felt are illustrated in the fact that Li Bai's verses were maintained wholly in the form of the it, though translators seem not to dare not to insert the I into them. This is an idea that Rosenzweig borrows from Klabund, who further comments that whereas the monosyllabism of the Chinese language gives the false impression of monotony, its written arrangement of words, one after another without any connection to one another, in fact promotes multiple interpretations and senses of each word to invoke, quote, agitation, mobility, colorfulness, and peculiarity. Not only is such dynamism the exact opposite of the picture of Semitic Chinese passivity proffered by Schlegel's speculations on their lack of verbal inflection, Rosenzweig also describes the purity of the perfectly instantaneous moment of feeling as an upsurge without a substratum, unencumbered by embodiment, which was a revision of a remark that was made by a consultant of the German Foreign Office named Willi Haas in his 1916 book, The Soul of the Orient. His remark was that Willi Haas's remark was that during the Boxer Rebellion, quote, Chinese servants were capable of suddenly turning against their erstwhile masters because the Oriental character comprised a next to one another of obscurely connected trains of thought, directions of the will, and emotional currents with no central I to organize them into a form recognizable and predictable by the Occidental. Predictably, Haas's racist pronouncement For, among other things, the Boxers were not in fact servants, but a martial arts society that led an anti-imperialist, anti-Christian uprising in the German concessionary of Shandong province. Predictably, Haas's racist pronouncement ascribes Chinese inconstancy to Confucianism, under whose principle of filial piety, on which ancestor worship is based, active agents were supposedly disappear into an invisible unity that stretched across generations. Rosenzweig, by contrast, describes this, what he calls upsurge without a substratum, as a capacity for self-concealment within self-concealment, that moreover is epitomized by Lao Tzu, the great sage who, as he writes, conquered China even within China, a defiance that fails to register as defiance for, say, Haas's Occidental, merely because China's soil, for historical reasons, had not produced the plants of the tragic. This is a surprising affirmation of the redemptive potential of a religious system that Rosenzweig otherwise situates outside of the path taken by the Jewish people to their anticipation of the perfect community, all with God, a path that, generally conceived, itself stands outside of the vicissitudes of world history. It is also the promise that Benjamin takes up when, in his Kafka essay of 1934, he suggests that China's ancestor cult is likened to the, quote, sacred Jewish ritual of erasing sins from the Book of Memory by virtue of the elementary purity of feeling described by Rosenzweig and given literary form by Kafka. For Kafka, according to Benjamin, is characterized by nothing if not the shame of which he is a scribe, and with which he writes as a scribe who has inscribed in writing the myriad ways in which characters are moved to shame, the leaps going nowhere, the gestures lacking a symbolism, the uncertain and ever-changing contexts and experimental groupings, which belie a world construed as and for the vocation of the purposive and productive individual, and the inadequacy of writing to capture the non-purposive except by virtue of capturing non-purposiveness, that is, actions without an intention or a salvational end, and therefore radically, profanely historical. Kafka is, as it were, taking the place of Claiborne's Libai for Benjamin. And the guilt that he documents, not mythic, as Adorno insisted, but historical, typifying the elemental yet precarious organization of life and work in a world that has been demystified of a salvational horizon as a necessary moment in the construction of the Protestant capitalist ethic. Benjamin, of course, had read Max Weber, responding to both Weber's The Protestant Ethic and its sequel, Confucianism and Daoism, in a short text entitled Capitalism as Religion of around 1923, in which he criticizes Weber for replicating the Jesuit-mediated image of Taoist inefficacy as a necessary fiction to exclude from his account of modern economic activity. In 1934, Benjamin takes Kafka as a scribe of the non-purposive actions that alone comprise the stuff of economic activity under capitalism, the Semitic and the Asiatic, that also pronounce its end. Rather than proposing a new ethical subjectivity situated after the end of history, Benjamin sees Kafka describing a so-called non-economic activity, such as studying, as a reiterative not forgetting that therefore posits forgetting of guilt of history as a redemptive possibility of undoing and redoing in permutations that are unlimited by the syndromes of autonomous individuality, of resisting erasure by insisting on erasure, an erasure of the traces for which an elocation of sins must have first taken place, unrestricted by any delimitation of accountability. As to what sort of politics this might amount to, what makes us human, after all, Benjamin seems to suggest, is the capacity not to do what everyone else is doing. And not only are such non-actions already included in modern capitalism's definition, they are based, Benjamin suggests, precisely in the indifference of nature to any of our propositions concerning how we set its end for it, including for our own natures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that incredibly rich, thought-provoking, but also very clear lecture. There's raised so many questions, and oh, sorry, I'm on the camera.
Oh.
And I'm sure some of you will have questions both in the room and also on Zoom. So if you're watching on Zoom and you have a question, please either type it in the chat, or you can sort of virtually raise your hand and we'll see if we can get you to speak it. But while you're doing that, if there's anybody in the room who has a question.
It's about because it's also in the title of your lecture, inactivity, right? So inaction. What was kind of sources for Benjamin or Rosenzweig for, because in Chinese, again, I'm not expert, there is a special word for inactivity, right?
Yeah.
Very bad.
Wu Wei.
Wu Wei, yes. I read once Daoism, so but what was the sources for Benjamin and Rosenzweig, for example, or other what, because you pointed out the sources for this kind of colonial nature,
Right.
kind of bad knowledge of colonial, but what was the good sources, right? First for Benjamin and Rosenzweig in this respect, because I'm very interested in the concept of inaction because of my research. So,
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, it's sort of contained in like this crazy thing I didn't explain what you were saying. This is like a quick sort of mind map I made of all my sources when I first started my project. And you can see that there's multiple sources. There wasn't like a good source, so to speak. They were all bad sources. So just to explain, so I already told you like who I'm looking at. They include obviously Rosenzweig and Benjamin, but also Buber, Kafka, etc., etc. They were reading translations of the Tao Te Ching and also the Zhuangzi and also other classic texts like that were made like the translations that were made into German. They were reading selected translations that were made into German amongst a plethora of translations into German that sort of had a that sort of like blossomed basically around the time that Germany started it took possession of that area in the Shandong province. So basically the source, I mean, the people who were sort of suddenly translating the Tao Te Ching and sort of transmitting that knowledge into to Germany were those who were suddenly sort of like in the Shandong area, in Qingdao, basically in the area, and had gained some kind of knowledge, whether with a native informant or somehow learning a bit of Chinese of their own, right? And publishing that back home. There was one particular source that was particularly well regarded by this group, which is the Protestant missionary Richard Wilhelm. So he's the one whose translations became most famous, and actually some of his translations are still standard. But they were also highly problematic in the sense, like from a sinological perspective, they were very Christianizing and misunderstood, like translated certain terms on the basis of his understanding of Goethe's Faust. I mean, some crazy stuff going on. The people who didn't know Chinese themselves, they sort of read that, but also didn't exclusively read Wilhelm's translations, which is what's interesting to me. Each of the people I'm looking at looked at also translations, for instance, by this person called Victor von Strauss, who was more of a sinologist, a slightly more serious sort of scholar, if you will, of Chinese classical texts that towards like the second half of the 19th century, who, however, also had his prejudices in his translations and commentaries on, say, the Tao Te Ching or whatever. Another source was a guy who may not have existed, which is super interesting, Alexander Ulla, who actually Heidegger also uses when he talks about Daoism. So there's this person who may or may not have, who's a phantom translator, whose translation was also used. They use multiple sources. Martin Buber is the person who supposedly translates the Zhuangzi on the basis, I think, of an English translation, but with the help of one of these, young Chinese man who came to Berlin, employed by one of the language schools I refer to teach sort of would-be officers and like whoever before they got shipped out to China. He had more of a sort of more of a firsthand, if not really firsthand, sort of like connection with the Chinese language. But it was also mediated in part by English translations. But in answer to like your question, like how they even got interested and like what actually were the initial sources. For Benjamin, so for Rosenzweig, it was probably Buber. So Buber already had translated some of the Zhuangzi by the time Rosenzweig wrote The Star of Redemption. So Rosenzweig's interest in Daoism probably came through Buber. How did Buber get interested in Daoism? It's probably the same way as Benjamin did, possibly Kafka, and also this person called Karl Wittfogel, who is one of these like lesser known figures of the early Frankfurt School, through the German youth movement. The German youth movement, specifically Gustav Winneken, I just did some work on this, but he had a university friend called Fritz Fiedler, who sort of disappeared at a very young age. But before he did, he and Winneken apparently had an extremely close relationship, lived together in a flat, talking about Daoism day and night. And I know this because of the archives of the German youth movement, but Fiedler translated the Tao Te Ching. It's not known what source he used, but the two of them had been studying, like self-studying the Tao Te Ching together, like on their own, using Victor von Strauss's commentary and translation. And then, and this is the thing I've been working on recently, Winneken then wrote a chapter-by-chapter commentary on the Tao Te Ching himself, which he never published, but informed probably his decision to later publish Fritz Fiedler's translation into German in one of I forget which archive, the Jugendbewegung probably, and then in book form, which is also a translation that Kafka used. Before that point, there's documents and a variety of sort of like sources from the time, and also secondary in terms of like histories of the German youth movement, like by Walter Laqueur, for example, who keep mentioning that everybody was reading Lao Tzu during, like as part, they had these like reading parties where the groups of the German youth would sort of sit around, lie flat. That's a joke for the Chinese. They're like tanping, right? Like they're literally just kind of lying flat, talking and listening to things said about the Tao Te Ching as part of their like youth movement activity. So it was a big thing, and I think Winneken was very instrumental in introducing this. And like, yeah, I think that there's it's not just that it's some esoteric sort of like manual for life that he introduced. Like there's terminological specificities to how he interpreted the Tao Te Ching that I've been tracking into what Benjamin wrote in his earliest texts. So yeah, that was a very long answer to a very simple question, but yeah. I mean, what I wanted to do in what I outlined today was ask the question, why did they pick Daoism specifically against all odds, if you will, right? Against the grain of the very established sort of colonial version of what Daoism was supposed to mean, which was also in basically all of the translations that they had to hand at that point. So why is it that, there was no particular reason why they would have all sort of converged on a particular version of Daoism, which was not present textually at all. I mean, all of the sources that they had, apart from the oral version that Winneken was giving before he published his friend's translation, were essentially the ones that derived from the colonial missionary networks of knowledge transmission.
Yes.
So if you answered, I just want to clarify if you've answered your own question. So your question was, why did they land on this? And you've offered
I've offered an answer. I've offered one today, maybe a partial one at least. Yeah.
Meaning in terms of them, in terms of the kind of like if I say it back to you, the equation, the equivalence in the earlier German thought, Jews and Taoism, Jewishness and Taoism.
Yeah.
Being away. That's your answer.
I think I think that's one answer.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very curious that there was this weird alignment, if we could call it that, right? Whether or not they were all systematically thinking that, I think that's sort of, I mean, the most systematic or the most explicit is the Kant, right? The end of all things. I mean, he's just literally saying, okay, there's only one person he could have been talking about, right? And he's likening that person to to Daoism, which had also been a version of like Chinese thinking that had also actually been defended by, post-Leibnizians essentially. So, yeah.
My question is, what impact does this have on, like Rosen's, like what you said today is so new. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Rosenzweig and sometimes thinking about Benjamin, and I've never seen before. This is like so new. What implications does it have on scholarship? It seems like it's like, well, yeah, what implications?
Yeah, well, I am hoping to offer, first of all, like major revisions of some major texts that result from these interchanges. So, taken in itself, like what Rosenzweig says about Taoism, I mean, I suppose, like, for Rosenzweig scholarship, it begs the question of like, what the place is of history in the star, what the place of politics is in the star. I mean, there's a whole thing I didn't mention about like the relationship between like the star redemption and also ideas that he develops in Globus, where he doesn't just sort of depict or sort of champion a type of imperialism that would sort of like beget redemption as a part as a process of like profane politics, but also has very specific things to say about Asia and the German colony. Like he refers to Kiao Chao, that's the name of the concession area, right, in China. So there's just like a very sort of different way of possibly understanding the intersection of like politics and theology in Rosenzweig in respect to like where the Chinese thought occurs in the contemporaneous, which Rosenzweig I think is very clear about, right? So I think that possibly sort of begets a whole question of, as I said, like, what role history plays in the picture he gives of redemption in the Star. In terms of his conversation with Benjamin, that leads, I think, to a wholly new sort of interpretation of the Kafka essay, which is a major essay in like Benjamin studies, right? The Kafka essay is a primary one, not just for the understanding of, say, Benjamin's thinking on a particular way of understanding literary production or the aesthetics of a sort of like the politicization of a certain kind of aesthetics, but also, and again, I didn't mention this super much, but like also, the debates that he and Adorno have about the Kafka essay turn precisely on the question of myth, and turn precisely from my angle, right? Turn precisely on whether you can see China as part of the contemporaneous fabric of the world or merely as part of myth, which is what Adorno's like intent on doing, not just in conversation with Benjamin about the Kafka essay, but also the Passagenwerk, the Baudelaire essay, like there's many instances where for like initial concepts that would become crucial for Adorno much later on, and therefore become like so the very fabric of the Frankfurt School, are worked out in these debates between Adorno and Benjamin concerning topics like the Kafka essay, where Adorno so completely like excises the notion that like China or these figures that Benjamin is sort of emphasizing have anything to do with the question of the modern organization of life and work. So that I think does have a major implication for the scholarship with respect to the genesis and also the future of the Frankfurt School of critical theory in that sense. Because as I mentioned very briefly, like critical theory has had a very hard time acknowledging that anything outside of Europe has had any impact on the way it was first formulated, or whether it can have an impact, like in terms of like the paradigms that it works with, whether it has any sort of relation to the global South. The ideas I'm working with are specifically from the global South. I mean, like at that point in time, at least, right? I mean, lots of people like Chinese were probably today would probably dispute whether the global South, but at that time, this is semi-colonial China, right? This is a very specific set of power dynamics that we're talking about that congeal themselves under the banner of China, right? These are ideas from the global South at this point that are formed like part of like the formation of like fundamental questions about myth and modernity that that would replicate themselves throughout the later sort of later critical theory without acknowledgement of that formative moment where there's an erasure of the question of a sort of necessity for a certain erasure, right? In this in the utility of the concept of modernity in critical theory. And then there's like more sort of technical aspects that I focus on, obviously, that come out of like specific readings. But in respect to what I presented today, I think let's focus on that.
We've had a series of interesting comments on Zoom chats. Thank you, Ephraim Nissan. But unless you're able to formulate those into a question, I think I will leave those for the time being. We have had a question from Tom Hastings. I think he sort of read my mind, actually. I'm curious to hear more about the map of reference points currently pictured, which I think you described as a quick mind map. In terms of its function in your research process and how it developed as a response to the archive.
So I have, let me see, this is quite blurry, but I have, this is just, this is like two halves of a very long mind map, basically. Roughly it's in 3 columns. I think this is the question, right? The people I consider my primary sources are sort of like the nodes that are here. I don't know if anyone can see. To the rightmost sort of column, I suppose, of nodes are my primary sources. So this is Buba. This is, I can barely see my own thing. Never mind. Somewhere is, that's Benjamin. That's the highest number of nodes as I started there. That's Rosenzweig. And to the left are their sources. So just back to the question of like what their sources were and like whether there were good sources, bad sources, or whatever. It's hard to sort of, it wasn't useful for me to distinguish it in that way because there were so many sources, but also so many overlaps of sources between various people, depending on which text it was that they were reading. So I guess and then to the even further left of that are the originals, as far as you can see, as I can tell, of those sources that my primary sources were using. So the sources my primary sources were using were obviously in a language that they could read, so typically not Chinese. And those are the list of like the original Chinese sources. I mean, and that ranges majorly in time, I mean, but they fall under like 3 categories, I suppose. They're philosophical text. I mean, would you call them philosophical text? They were treated as philosophical text, so like the Daoism, the Zhuangzi. They didn't really look at commentaries of those in the Chinese. They were just simply they weren't. They were also looking at poetry collections, and there were so for instance, I talked about one today, Li Bai, right? There's a German translation of Li Bai that Rosenzweig refers to, that also Benjamin read at some point, and also Kafka. So there's Li Bai, and then there's also another. There's also a the name escapes me now, but like um, a Ming Dynasty writer of short stories that Bubo translates, obviously with the help of we call a native informant, I suppose. And so those texts are sort of both ancient and also converge in, I think, the Ming Dynasty. And these are the translations or commentaries or partial commentaries or partial editions that refer to those Chinese sources. There's also another famous one, actually, Sima Tian, who was a historian who basically gives us the story of where Lao Tzu supposedly came from. I mean, also, by the way, we don't know if Lao Tzu existed, just to say, like, we sort of think he did because Sima Tian said he did, right? But also the idea that he like gave his he like was gonna exit and like leave to the mountains and like wrote it down before he left. I mean, that's Sima Qian telling the story. Obviously forms the foundation of the famous poem by Bertolt Brecht eventually, right, on the origin of the Daoism. So anyway, so those sources, these are the translations or like some sort of like the mediations, I suppose, and then cross-referencing of those mediated sources by the various figures that I'm looking at. What became really interesting for me is, I think, also evident in what I was trying to present today, was that it's not really, I didn't find it really useful to focus on individual figures. So I don't have chapters on like Rosenzweig and Buber and Benjamin and whoever and Bloch, for example. What was much more interesting to me were the conversations that they had about things, right? So in the project I have made, the map also like reflects a little bit of that. Like each person sort of appears 2, maybe 3 times in the overall book project in my manuscript, because it's actually through those debates that the overall picture, which is highly unsystematic, right, emerges of this alternative testament to this period. So that's my method, I suppose. That hopefully answers your question. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, there are 2 more. Okay, I think. Oh, was there one else?
No, no.
I think your
I've
hand
already
went.
asked, so.
Well, you both already asked, so I think.
Go ahead.
Question whether through, well, okay, wait, first of all, one of the things I'm thinking about is if you've got these German Jews were all, like, there's always some work about Jewish primitivism, about how like the exact figures that you're talking about, Kafka, Buber, Rosenzweig, maybe Benjamin also, all get really interested in Yiddish-speaking Ostjuden, like East European Jews, as kind of representing something more authentic. But what you're just, and I wonder whether that, and like part of that can be understood as the German Jew in this generation understanding themselves as colonized subjects. So there's a way in which how you're describing it is part of the strategy. This is what you're saying, I realize. It's part of the strategy of their decolonization I now realize I'm just saying back exactly what your lecture was. Okay, I'm going to go to a new question.
No, but I mean, thank you. No, but thank you. I hadn't thought about that connection at all. I mean, so that's really interesting. I think that's a really good way to sort of like frame Buba, especially.
Yeah.
Because he's the one who has a very distinctive understanding of the Orient. But then if you triangulate that with the other Orient, which is like way further Orient, much, you have a very interesting like understanding, like maybe new sort of complication of like what he's, how he sees, the self,
And so then my question I have is via Benjamin, although also Buber and Rosenzweig, I'm curious about whether, because you mentioned, I think you've studied Scholem.
Yeah.
I'm curious about whether Scholem's study of the Kabbalah, whether he's doing any mapping of any, because Scholem's studying the Kabbalah in a way, like really in a new way. And I wonder whether he's mapping any of these understandings of Chinese systems onto how he then reads the Kabbalah.
Oh, Scholem, you mean?
Scholem, yeah. Because he's so influenced by Buber, Rosenzweig, and Benjamin.
I have no idea. I don't know. Scholem, I have not found anything of significance that would draw him into my story, interestingly. But I also have this very specific theory about why Sholem and Benjamin were friends. So that might be just me. I don't think that, I think Sholem wanted to be his friend more than Benjamin wanted to be. I mean, yeah, I think it was an unequal friendship. That Benjamin had a secret friend, etc. But I mean, but yeah, Benjamin, I think like this doesn't answer your question, but I think Benjamin befriended Sholem because Sholem was a student of mathematics at the time. So this is not this work at all, but like stuff I did before. But Benjamin wrote about math in weird places. He got the information from Sholem. Sholem was a math major in university. That's why they were friends, etc. But I don't know. But to answer your question, I haven't found anything of significance in Sholem per se. I mean, yeah, not really. But I'll look. I'll keep my eyes open.
So I think final question.
Yeah, asking now, not from the point of view of verbal transmission of text or ideas, but how do they interpret with other concepts?
Yeah.
Of an activity, right? Because for me, people mentioned Benjamin clearly and had this very strong link to Marxism, right? Where activity was like Marx praises activity in his first 45 books, right? Ethica and kind of German atheist, the main achievement of them is discovery of responsibility, right? So inaction in this context, what for Benjamin, or even more to leftists and Marxists, correct? You mentioned this point about that. What for them would be inaction in this context? Because it's kind of revolutionary praxis, which is definitely action, right? Not inaction. Of course, we talk about economics of capitalism as a problem, because in Daoism, as far as I understand, again, from my very superficial knowledge of the sources, that in Daoism, for example, inaction, of course, is not this simply kind of not doing, right? Definitely not. It's like, as far as it's part of kind of governmental activities, it's part of ethical principle, like not intervening into the natural course of events, something like this. Of course, it's very vague, but how we can, what was there, if they did any interpretation of inaction?
Yeah. So that's a great question, but also a gigantic one. And I think so. No, but it's like, but my the two things. The first is that they each have a very different answer, but out of each debate that I'm looking at, a very sort of specific version of non-action emerges. So in fact, the overarching theme of my entire book is how inaction sort of gets articulated in these various different ways by these people in the specific context of their very specific debates. So, but I can give you a couple of examples. So, for instance, in regard to what I just presented, inaction, in the sense that Benjamin wants to take via his very specific kind of reading of Rosenzweig through Kafka, is one that is always already included in what economic activity is conceived as, right? It's sort of historically, it's a necessary fiction to be excised. In Marxist terms, I think this is where I suppose some Marxists will argue this is where surplus value also comes from, right? This is the embedding of inactivity, and I think what Benjamin wants to do with it specifically, though, he sort of globalizes this understanding of this economic inactivity that's sort of built into economic productivity by seeing it not just as a index of alienation, right, in the under modern capitalism, but in fact also as this almost insurrectionary moment, right? A possibility for an insurrectionary moment, because it stands outside of the capacity for a certain historiography of economic activity, even via Marxism, to comprehend that. And this, I think, is precisely why it's interesting and important that this is derived from China, and a very specific China, and specifically from a very specific version of Rosenzweig, thinking about Chinese insurrection more like, since like in 1900, right? There's another, I didn't have time to mention this also, but also in the Kafka essay is this very bizarre reference that nobody to my mind has commented on to an anarchist geographer where who sort of Benjamin uses to describe how the China of Kafka's imagination is a land that is whose governing principle is the movement of rivers. This is important because of a couple of things, but the very lots of things to say about that. But the main thing to say about that is that there is a indication there that Benjamin's understanding of Marxism was also inflected by the Marxist theory of the Asiatic mode of production, and that which is based in the idea that Asiatic Asiatic Oriental what Engels I think calls Oriental despotism is based on a version of governance that is based on rivers as opposed to city states, right? That never made its way to modernity through feudalism. That it was a completely alternative path to modernity that bypassed the formation of the proletariat. In other words, it's peasantry, right? And in other words, taking this thought seriously also implies taking seriously the idea that there's multiple paths to modernity, that those those chronologies are somehow simultaneous and non-simultaneous. Now I'm thinking about Bloch. Bloch is the one who like really explores this idea, but also that it also ties in specifically to the major debates that were going on precisely from the mid-20s to the early 30s. About the possibility for a peasant revolution. And this he would have gotten through Wittfogel. And Benjamin was actually reading Wittfogel when he was thinking about revising his Talspiel book. So, but that's kind of another story. But this whole thing about rivers in China is really important. It's not, it's weird that it takes the form of an essay on Kafka, right? I haven't solved the question of why he needed Kafka at all, actually. So, if anyone has great ideas about that, let me know. But I don't know why Kafka is needed. I think it's already bizarre that he uses Rosenzweig as his sole source of anything Chinese in the Kafka essay. That's what I try to work out today. But the broader implications of the Kafka essay, which obviously he already says to Adorno, like, look, this is not just about Kafka, right? It's about modernity. It's also about like, a certain idea of bureaucracy ultimately, right? Is Kafka just incidental to that? Or is it just because like so many people have already thought, or is it just because like Kafka happened to already write on Chinese themes, and so he was just like convenient? I'm not entirely sure. But there's so many coded things in the essay that one can unpack also that have a lot to do with like where this inactivity, how this inactivity manifests. And so just to come back to that question, like what is it in that respect? It's everything that like it's all types of like sort of activity that fall outside the realm of what looks like revolutionary activity from a strictly sort of like proletarianized version of from a version of world history, Marxist historiography that takes one through the feudal city-states to proletarianization necessarily, and therefore through that version of alienation that that would impose a certain reading on what Kafka's figures do, namely they're merely sort of mythic like they're expressions of like they're mythic expressions of like a certain like alienation in the cities, right? I hope I answered that question.
That draws the formal proceedings of this evening to a close. If you are in the room physically, we have a drinks reception next door, and you're very welcome to join us for that. If you're watching on Zoom, unfortunately, you're not able to join us for that, but I do appreciate you joining us to watch the lecture this evening. And all that remains is for us to thank once again our speaker this evening, Julia Ng, for a fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.